and welcome to another exciting stop on our Round the World in 80 Teas podcast series. My name is Sharon Hall and I'm Chief Executive of the United Kingdom Tea and Infusions Association. And today we're going to be talking about second flush Assam teas from India with my co-host Will Battle and our guests Kurush Bharucha and Ravi Shushanti. Will has been in the tea industry for over 25 years. He's a UK-based wholesaler and he is the author of the World Tea Encyclopedia. Ravi Shushanti has recently retired, although he looks too young for that, having worked as a planter on Assam's best tea gardens and as chairman of the world's largest tea broker, J. Thomas & Co. Kurush Bharucha is a professional tea taster who's been with Unilever Tea for over 36 years, and he's currently working as the company's Tea Expertise Director. His experience spans all aspects of tea's bush to brand consumer journey, and he is a passionate spokesperson for tea. Kurush, Ravi, and Will, thank you for joining me today, and welcome to this podcast. I'm going to hand over to my co-host, Will, to start us off.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks, Sharon. Well, I suppose we're starting off with Assam, and really does produce unique teas. And perhaps, Ravi, you can start us off with a little bit of a flavour of the location and the environment and the climate that one would expect in Assam.
Sharon, Will, Kurush, thank you so much. A pleasure meeting all of you on this podcast. I'm Ravi Shushanti, a tea aficionado, and till recently chairman of J. Thomas & Company, from where I've retired, 3 weeks ago. So coming into Assam, Assam is on the northeastern fringe of India. It's about 27 degrees north on the latitude and just below the Tropic of Cancer. Amongst the differences that Assam has is tea is grown in the Bhramaputra Valley, the only region of Assam where you have the valley. If you are comparing Assam with, say, Africa or Sri Lanka in South India, all those geographies are fairly close to the equator. So tea is grown on the hill tracts against Assam, where tea is grown on the valley. Because of this, you have a huge amount of difference between Assam and the rest of the geographies. So Assam has pretty much a 9-month season against teas which are grown on the equator or close to the equator, which are perennial. So Sri Lanka, South India, Kenya is where perennial teas are grown perennially. In Assam, teas are grown for 9 months of the year. And because of the geographical location, Assam has distinct flushes. In tea parlance, it's called flushes in India. The other countries call it harvest. So you have a spring harvest, which India calls first flush. You have a summer harvest, which India calls second flush, which is what we're going to be talking a lot more about today. And then you have the monsoon and the rains flush, where Assam produces the bulk of its tea. And we close the season with the cold weather, the autumn flush. So that's pretty much Assam. And Assam's second flush has huge amounts of rain, heat, humidity, which adds to a certain malty flavor that comes in from Assam. That kind of thickness and body, which Assam is associated for and known worldwide, is something that you would not get in any other part of the world. So that's Assam, introducing Assam for you.
Fantastic, Ravi, thanks so much. One of the things that always it seems to me about Assam is, you alluded to it, that humidity and in the alluvial soils of the valley. Someone once said to me that you could stick almost anything in the ground and it will have grown by the next day. It's so fertile.
Absolutely right. Assam, as you said, is alluvial soil. It's also sandy loam. And we have a saying in tea that if you throw a hockey stick into Assam, you'll have a hockey stick factory that's going to come through. The soil is that fertile. So Assam is unique in more ways than one. Of course, with global warming, things have changed enormously. Assam used to be really, it was what we would call as the English summer weather that you would have in the Assam Valley for more often than not. So when I joined the industry way back in 1978, right up to May, you would wear a sweater in Assam more often than not. And today, we don't wear a sweater in Assam right up to December. So how things have changed with global warming?
If I may, will just amplify a little bit about what Ravi has said about Assam in terms of the unique terroir that this tea origin has. So yes, it's very wet, it's sunny, and it's steamy. But I think it's worth remembering the importance of the Bhramaputra river, which plays a key part in the geography of this place. The Brahmaputra river is a river which starts in the highlands of the Himalayas in Tibet. It flows through the Assam Valley before discharging itself into the Bay of Bengal in Bangladesh. And the river really defines the way the tea estates have come about. You know, we refer to North Bank estates and South Bank estates, and all of that is in reference to the river. So just as in other tea growing countries like Kenya, where you refer to east of the Rift Valley or west of the Rift Valley, in Assam you refer to North Bank and South Bank. It's also worth remembering that Assam is just a prodigious producer of tea. It makes 10% of the world's tea. And it is the largest single contiguous tea growing area in the world. So it really is a sea of tea. You know, when you get into an Assam plantation, it's almost like an endless horizon and vista of tea bushes, beautifully shaded, you know, with trees. And it's just what makes tea so magical in this part of the world.
Assam's really in that area where we can sort of see the origin of the bush. Is there something you can say about that?
Yes, thanks, Will. I think that's a really good question to ask, and it's worth our listeners understanding that, you know, there is this arc-shaped region in that part of the world, which is really at the intersection of southwestern China's Yunnan province, northeastern India's Assam province, and northern Burma's Kachin province. And that is the area where tea was indigenous. That is where tea was not a bush, but it grew as, you know, big wild trees, and where tea is indigenous and which is almost regarded as the birthplace of tea. So Assam certainly has a connection also to where tea is you know, widely regarded to have been born.
The wild tea plant in Assam was called the Miang, M-I-A-N-J, okay? And that was grown all over. So when in 1823, if my memory serves me right, when the Bruce brothers got into actually planting tea in Assam, that's Robert Bruce and Charles Bruce, at that point of time, they were trying to bring in seeds from China, because China was, if China was not the first to indigenously produce tea, it was the first to actually cultivate tea in a commercial manner, which goes back to almost 50 BC. So the origins of Indian Assam tea was trying to bring in the China seed. It didn't work in the Indian context, and that's when the Bruce brothers, who happened to be in Assam at that point of time, went across and met someone called Bom Bisa Gam. He was the local Singpo chief in that part of the world, and he actually introduced the Bruce brothers to the Assam tea plant. And that's where the Assam tea story actually starts. So the first plantation Assam is actually called Cha Bua, means tea garden. Okay, and that happened way back in 1835. So the story of Assam tea actually starts from there.
That's a great picture. One of the things that struck me when I first went to Assam is, although India exists on one time zone, I remember landing and on the gardens I had to change my watch. Can you explain that?
It's very much like your daylight saving hours that you have up in most of the colder countries. Assam has what we call as garden time. This started when tea was planted into Assam in the early 1835s, 1840. At that point of time, there was it was just forest, large tracts of forest land, which the then planters were uprooting and planting tea on. And you didn't, you had no electricity. Population was thin, to say the least. So they wanted to make the most of the daylight hours. And because of that, and since Assam is way up in the northeast, the sun rises a lot faster. So Arunachal is like Japan. You have Arunachal where the sun rises the earliest in this part of the world. Arunachal borders Assam. So during summertime, 4:30 in the morning, it's bright and sunny. and by 6:30 in the evening, it's pitch dark. So to make the most of the daylight hours is what you had garden time for. But Will, garden times, I hate to tell you this, but garden time is no more the norm. It's over now. Uh, over the last 2 decades, we don't have a garden time. And if you check with some of the younger generation and you tell them garden time, he'll look at you in shock and say, "What's that?" So we're pretty much on Indian Standard Time now.
Yes, so I think it used to be this wonderful, quirky, 1 hour ahead of Indian Standard Time is what the tea industry in Assam used to follow. But unfortunately, as Ravi says, most tea garden staff and people who are working there, today everyone has a mobile phone and everyone knows the time. So it's unfortunately gone a little bit out of fashion. It's not in use now, but yes, it was a lovely sort of a little quirky thing. It was called Bagan time, and Bagan is the Indian word for a tea garden. So Bagan time used to be 1 hour ahead of Indian Standard Time.
So if we dive into the teas that they're making in Assam, one of the things, and Ravi, you alluded to it earlier, one of the words that comes up in our industry is flush, and distinct periods of growth on the gardens. And when we're talking about Assam and its best teas, really we're looking at the second flush. Could you just explain a little bit about the seasonality and the difference you might get between the spring teas and then the second flush that we're going to be talking in more detail about?
Sure. The Assam tea bush, or the tea bush worldwide, it's like the human body. Okay, it goes to rest, it goes to sleep, which is the winter dormancy period. So our winter dormancy period starts around December and it lasts up to the early part of March. So when the bush comes out of its dormancy is when it's called first flush. First flush starts in Assam around the first week of March, and it's a very short period of harvest, which is barely about 3 weeks of time. So it starts in the first week of March, and by the end of March, first week of April, the first flush is over. At this point of time, the bush characteristic is a little different. It's full of starch because it's rested. Its starch reserves in the plant are extremely high, and the color of the leaf, the tea leaf that you harvest, is a light pale green. The cup has very, very layered nuances to it. It's thin, it's green, it's bright. It has that freshly grassy cut flavor to it, which we call as green. But because of the starch, high starch and nutrient reserves and high caffeine content, and because first flush is rather short, those teas don't keep as well as second flush Assams do. Then, like the human body, after we've done a little bit of work, you need to go to rest for a little bit. You take your coffee break at about 11:30, 12, so that the bush does the same thing. It goes into Banji. So around the first week of Banji, the bush goes into a short period of recess, or lull as you would want to call it. Quality at that point of time is pretty ordinary, to say the least. And then post the coffee break, the bush is ready, revived, ready to work once again. And that's when the best harvest comes through, what we call a second flush. So second flush normally starts around the first, second week of May. By and large, the second week of May is when people say the ideal growing conditions take place in Assam. At that point of time, Assam is muggy, it's hot, it's humid, and the bush leaf color turns a pale yellow. Okay, at this point of time, second flush is on. Normally, most of us old school people, we've got a huge amount of marigold trees that are planted on most of the roadsides in Assam. So when the marigolds are in full bloom, it's when we say Assam's second flush is in full bloom. That's how we equate it with the marigold tree. So that's just some of the stuff that one picks up over a period of time that you're in the tea trade. So second flush normally in Assam lasts, as I said, from May right up to end June, first week of July. But what has happened is, again, because of global warming, and Kurush would correct me if he thinks differently, what I find is the best Assam second flush actually now comes towards the end of May rather than the second week of May. And it runs you right up to the middle of July because our monsoons have got delayed. In fact, more often than not, I tell my packeteer friends, better to buy a July tea, which keeps better sometimes than the early May teas. So that's second flush for you. Post second flush, that's starting July, August, September, October. 4 months of the year, North India harvests 60% of its production. So that's what we call in tea parlance as our peak cropping months. 60% of our production is made. So we could call it as a rains flush. You could call it as a monsoon flush. That's how it works. And post-October, it fades away into what we call as an autumn flush and a cold weather or a winter flush. So that's pretty much the production pattern in Assam.
If you're looking to buy a nice second flush tea, what are you looking for? What are the characteristics that you're looking for in taste? And
I think in terms of the flush, if I can just maybe add one or two things, it's a very unusual word which is used in the tea trade, this thing about a flush. And a flush really, I think for the lay consumer to understand is nothing more than a fresh outgrowth of shoots. So I think one of the most lovely things about the tea bush, and I'm turning a little philosophical here, is that it is unconditionally giving. You know, the tea bush gives you a fresh flush every 10 or 15 days. You pluck it and you collect it in your baskets and you turn it into tea. And then 15 days later, when you come back to that place, it's again unconditionally giving you. So I think it's such a beautiful expression of generosity that it doesn't expect anything in return, but it just keeps on, it's the gift that keeps on giving. So that's really what a flush is. And the unusual thing about Assam is that the Assam second flush, which is sort of world famous, is quite unusual in the fact that most other origins of the world, most of the super premium teas around the world really, romanticize and sort of premiumize their first flush. So spring teas, whether it's in Japan, spring teas, whether it's in China, spring teas, whether they are in Darjeeling even, spring teas are what most of the world's terroirs typically, celebrate. Assam is probably the only one which talks about second flush, which is actually it's sort of blue ribbon tea in the year. So it's a little unusual in terms of the second flush in Assam versus, spring teas in the rest of the world, which are very, very premium. I thought I'll just add that layer on to sort of complete the story that Ravi started.
It's a great picture you paint, Kurush. And what are we tasting? What are we looking for in one of the teas?
So I think if you look at Assam second flush, and I'm sure Ravi will bear me out, but for me when I think of the word Assam, I've almost sort of in my mind got A for amber, and that's the beautiful deep color of the cup that you get. S is for strong, which is the wonderful, when you say Assam teas, you're talking like, it reminds me of a weightlifter. Assam teas are hefty, they are full-bodied, and they are punchy. Yeah, so it's really like a bodybuilder. That's the S for strong. The other S, I would say, is for stimulating, and that stimulating is what makes it a picker-upper. An Assam tea is a picker-upper. It gets you out of bed. And why is that? Because of the rich levels of caffeine, which is in Assam tea, and that's what makes it so stimulating. The other A, I would say, is for astringent. So I'm moving on to ASSAM, as you will follow. And that is because of the tannins in the tea. So Assam teas have got this, sort of a slightly mouth-puckering, drying sensation that you get when you taste it. And then the final M is, I think, the sort of icing on the cake, which is that, typical maltiness, the mouthfeel, the thickness, the viscosity, the juiciness. It's all of these aspects. When I started in the tea trade, we would brew a cup of tea, and then my seniors would say, you can stand your spoon in a cup of Assam tea. That's how thick and viscous and honey-like and treacle-like it is. So that's what makes Assam tea, just such a pleasure. I think our tea board says it best. The Indian tea board, when it advertises Assam tea, they say, if strength is your weakness, then Assam is your cuppa.
I love that. And just personally, that strength and that astringency, for me personally, makes Assam the perfect tea to go with an English breakfast. When you've got that sort of heavy kind of food with eggs and bacon, a pot of Assam with that is just fantastic. And would you say that's a good match?
That's an English breakfast is a marriage made in heaven, really. So traditionally, if you look at the what I call the legacy teas in South Asia, teas from Sri Lanka and teas from Assam. The English, of course, took these teas back to the UK, and the English breakfast was what they came up with, which was just a wonderful combination of the teas they had access to. So they had access to Sri Lankan teas, which are orthodox and flavory and delicate and light, and then they had access to Assam teas, which were CTC and stronger and fuller. So one gave you strength, one gave you flavor. Put the two together, and that's your English breakfast.
So you just mentioned two terms there, orthodox and CTC. For our audience, can we explain?
So yeah, I think orthodox and CTC are just two styles of manufacture of black tea. Yeah, so just as when you make green tea, people might hear of steamed green teas or pan-fried green teas. Similarly, when you talk about black teas, they are typically differentiated by one process, which is the degree of maceration that the leaf undergoes. So it's very, very simple. You pluck a leaf, you let it sort of almost lie dormant for a while. It loses its moisture. It turns flaccid and limp. You then break the leaf and then you expose it to the air. So, to keep things very, very simple, that's the beauty about tea. When you look at tea manufacture, all it involves is reducing moisture, and all it adds is the air. And honestly, that is how tea is made. To cut a long story short, I can't tell you about CTC and orthodox, but the magic is in its simplicity. And orthodox and CTC are just processes by which one is a gentler process, which is the orthodox black tea manufacturing style. It's almost akin to rolling a leaf on your palm round and round in a gentle way. And the other is a much more vigorous process. So it sort of it's much more vigorous. It chops it up. It, tears the leaf into hundreds of shreds. And as a result of these two processes, the resultant tea can be either slightly lighter or slightly stronger, slightly slow brewing or slightly quick brewing. And that's really what CTC and orthodox is about at a simplistic level.
In the early years, there was just green tea and black tea. There was nothing called a CTC and orthodox. Orthodox came in only because CTC came into being. So the earlier teas were clean and black, and orthodox was the traditional way you made tea. Okay. The precursor to CTC actually is something called as a leg cut. Leg cut is nothing but a device that was used by the tobacco industry to shred its leaf. So the leg cut came into being, and sometime in 1940 is when the CTC came into being. Okay, CTC was primarily because we wanted much more cuppage. So if one were to do a yard scale, in orthodox per kilo, you would get about 200, 250 cups per kilo. And in CTC, because the steeping is much faster and because it's a denser product, and like Kurush said, the cell breakup is so much more vigorous and significantly more, you get a cuppage of roughly anything from 400 to 500 cups a tea. So today, with the consumer being on the run, on the go, nobody's got time, CTC is the more popular or the preferred beverage. But there are large parts of the world which continue to drink a lot of orthodox even today. Talking about orthodox, I'll tell you a story of how orthodox actually came into being. Kurush made this little sign of the leaf being rolled in the hand. That's exactly how orthodox used to be made in the early years. Then came in this planter from Kachar, which is a part of Assam, and there was no industry those days. It was all forest. So this planter came up with this novel idea, if I would call it. He put in tea leaves, he cut his trouser legs, and he put the tea leaves into the trouser leg, tied up two ends of the trouser, put it on a table, and inverted another table on it with the four legs standing up. And these two tables would be rubbed like that, and that's how the tea actually got rolled. And that's why even today, the orthodox table is called a rolling table. Okay, so these are strange stories that you keep come across. So planters are jack of all trades, master of none. But believe me, planters come up with the most ingenious ideas.
To just finish that with a tail note, Assam is the world's largest producer of CTC tea.
Absolutely right. Assam makes about 700 million kilos of tea. On a normal year, it's as big as Kenya and Sri Lanka combined, actually, in real terms. That's 4 lakh hectares of tea in Assam.
Can I pick up on one of the points that you made earlier, Kurush? In your beautiful description of Assam through the letters that make up the name. You talked about astringency, and how would you drink a cup of Assam tea? Because for some, if it can come across as quite a strong tea, what would your recommendation be?
So I think, yes, it can be a double-edged sword at times, because the tea is so overpoweringly, it is really a punchy tea. And, as some people say, it knocks your socks off. Or in the UK, they have this term, they call it builder's brew. So a builder's brew is what a construction worker will sort of want, because he's doing heavy work and he wants a strong cup of tea. So, Assam, by its very definition, stands for strength and that astringency. The best way, I would say, to moderate that, again, and it's a little bit about horses for courses. So if I was to drink an Assam Orthodox tea, a second flush Assam Orthodox tea, which has got a lovely sort of a honeyed sweetness to it, I would probably drink it without milk. But if I was having a CTC Assam tea, which was really sort of gutty and viscous, then this is what I would be having. I would be having it with a dash of milk. And what the milk does is just to sort of make it a little smoother and take away a little bit of that sort of, rasping, mouth puckering, slightly drying sensation that the astringency of Assam can sometimes have. So some people might find, Assam tea a little too strong. And I think the best way that Indians have cottoned on to it is, by their invention of chai, which is, milk, spices, sugar, and Assam tea.
That's great. I'm drinking mine. I've just added I've got a strong CTC here, and I've got some full fat Jersey cow milk, and it's a great combination.
A lot of the people who drink Assam will tell you that when I do have my Assam, it fills up the belly. It's like a food that they're actually talking about. That's because of, like Kurush said, because of the viscosity that the tea has. So tea, a good Assam tea with a couple of biscuits or any other savory that you would want is an ideal tummy tucker, as I would call it.
and also remember, India is a poor country. Tea is not just a little beverage that you have in the, like you might have in some of the Western countries. A thick cup of tea, it's almost soupy. It's almost like a little meal. Somebody will dip his 2 slices of bread, and for many poor people on the go and on the street, it's a mini meal in itself. So I think the beauty about tea is, again, how it evolves, in the culture in which it flourishes.
I've seen written down that it has a raspberry jam quality. Can someone tell me more about that?
That is a fading, that is not something that many people recognize these days. Unfortunately, it's a certain type of bush in certain parts of Assam, which was very peculiar to certain estates, or certain single origin estates. And I have a few at the back of my head, which will not mean anything to many of the readers. But if you grow up, tasting Assam tea, you will get familiar with brand names like Khobong, Bordubi, Kihang, Itakuli. These are typically tea gardens which had sections in them, which, when you processed, had this wonderful. When I was a trainee, we would call it BC, which stands for black currant. So we would say, this tea has a little BC, or it has more BC, or it's very pronounced BC. So black currant is one terminology. You referred to, Sharon, the other terminology, which is RJ, which is raspberry jam. And it's just 2 sides of the same coin. It's just a question of how different tasters would identify it. But it had this wonderfully sweet summer fruits, a black currant or raspberry, or call it, what you will. But that was the sort of hint of that nuanced taste which was there in this very, standout Assam tea. And I wish we would see more of that these days. But unfortunately, I think you see less and less as the years go by.
Yes, it's a fading flavor, as Kurush has mentioned. You hardly ever get it now. When I joined the trade, you'd have enough and more, and the gardens have been named by Kurush, with Khobong actually being the outstanding one. That used to be the garden that would produce the maximum amount of raspberry jam flavored teas, and it came from a certain type of clone. But yeah, it's a fading trait. You don't really see too much of it now. A pity, though.
Yes.
I've got a question for you, Ravi, which is also picking up on on Karish's point about the strength and the power of Assam tea. You're standing in the J. Thomas tasting room as you speak to us, J. Thomas being the largest broking house in the world. And on a big day during the season, how many cups of strong Assam tea would you have to taste? And how did you cope?
Wonderful. Okay, let me move away and I'll give the viewers a sight of our tasting room. That's about 65% of it, and the balance is beyond me. This is the single largest tea tasting room in the world. We liquor on an average 800 cups of tea in one round. If push comes to shove, it'll be about 1,000 cups of tea. And we do on a big day, anything between 4 to 5 rounds a day. So that could be between 4,000 to 5,000 cups of tea, done by different tasters. But on an average, during peak season, a normal taster or a senior taster, I would call it, would do anything between 500 to 800 cups of Assam tea, and on a really big day, getting close to 1,000 cups of tea a day of tasting. So that's a lot of tasting that goes on. We've got another equally large tasting room, which we built in our Guwahati facilities, which also handles about the same volume of tea.
And how do you cope when you've got a very strong set of teas? Does your palate manage to work its way through to number 799 as well as number 1?
During peak season, we keep tasting. The palate is changing all the time. It keeps recognizing the taste of each tea very, very distinctly. So a senior taster would be able to tell you, hey, this particular tea belongs to garden X. This particular tea resembles very similar garden B. And when you ask the tea boy, am I right? And more often than not, he'll say, you've got the garden right. But during second time, when, like Kurush said, when you have the really thick, juicy Assams, as I would call them, and teas with very high viscosity, after about 50 or 100 cups, you do take a little bit of you rinse your mouth with lukewarm water, and then you start fresh.
And I think when, again, I'm going back to, when I learned my tasting 35 years back, we were always, there was always a bowl of hot water. There was always a little biscuit, perhaps, or there was always a little slice of apple at the end of a batch, which you could sort of rinse your mouth and almost get it back to, base in a way, before you sort of keep plunging into sort of tasting. Because in those days, we did taste 1,000 cups of tea a day. That's what it involved. You were out as a trainee, irrespective of what bench was tasting what cup. As a trainee, you just had to go out, taste, and taste. And as my mentor at that time said, practice makes perfect. So perfect your practice. And that's why, you just got better by doing it. There was no rocket science in it. The more you do, the better you get. And unfortunately, that is something which, again, a lot of the new breed of tasters who come in need to understand that, there are no shortcuts to tea. It does take time to develop a palate memory. It does take time to familiarize yourself with origins around the world, and, let your palate, speak for itself. Yeah.
I have 2 questions from the position of a complete novice. First question is, do you taste them with and without milk? And secondly, would you guys, looking back on your careers, would you recommend this role to someone new who wants to come into the industry?
Darjeelings and Orthodox are tasted without milk. Assams are always tasted with milk. That's how it's done. On an average, 2.5 grams of tea are used per cup in 150 mils of water, and the tea is steeped for about 5 minutes. You can't taste Darjeeling or Orthodox with milk. It doesn't work at all, particularly Darjeeling. You'll manage to get away with milk on a second flush thick malty Orthodox, but definitely not otherwise. CTC is almost impossible to taste without milk.
And would you recommend it, the career?
Yes, of course, I would definitely recommend it as a career. I've done 42 years in the trade. And when I was talking about my retirement to my colleagues, I said, if I were to turn the clock back, and now that I've got a little more wisdom with all the gray hair, chances are I've joined the tea trade again, and Thomas is at that.
Yeah, I think I can only sort of heartily agree with Ravi. I mean, it's, you can't get into tea tasting by, there is no university for it. You just stumble into it by accident. You can't plan to be a tea taster. And I think that's what many of us, just stumble into it and just learned on the job. And unfortunately, that is still, I think, it's a leap of faith which one has to take and then stick with it and see how best you can, hopefully stay the course and pick up everything that's there. Just a little nuance on the with and without milk. I think Ravi is spot on. In terms of Darjeeling teas, it's a no-brainer. These are self-drinkers. They have to be had, without milk to bring out, all the sort of levels of flavor that they have. When it comes to Assam Orthodox tea, though, there are some countries in the world, like in Iran, which is a very, very big buyer of Indian Orthodox tea, where they don't have tea with milk. There are some parts, I think even in Germany, there's a particular district, and I'm digressing a bit, but I hope it's found useful, for our listeners. There's a little region called East Friesland, which is in the northern part of Germany, which buys the most wonderful second flush teas season after season. Again, they don't always have it with milk, but they do add a dash of cream to it. And they have this wonderful ritual of the richest Assam Orthodox teas with a profusion of golden tip, almost similar to what I'm showing here. And what they do is they have a very typical rock sugar, which is first put in a cup. Then they have this beautiful Assam Orthodox tea, which has got this sort of honeyed sweetness to it. And then they add a bit of cream along the side of the cup. And what that does, it's a three-dimensional taste. Initially, you get a milky taste from the cream. Then you get into the heart of the second flush tea around the middle of the cup. And finally, towards the bottom, you get a bit of that sweetness, which comes from that lump sugar. So, that's the beauty about tea. Every little country has developed its own sort of optimal ceremony of sorts.
I think the East Frisian drinking tradition is a great comment point, because it just tells a story that there's not one way of drinking tea. There's no one is to say that my way is the right way. And the Ostfrieslanders, I think if they were a nation of their own right, would be in the top 5 tea drinking nations in the world. And I love that about the fact that this small pocket of tea drinking culture can exist between the Dutch border and Emden, I think. And yet it's got this really unique culture that's really built on Assam tea that you really don't find anywhere else in Germany.
That's what they say about that little province. They say, where the water is soft and the tea is bold. That's how they describe the tea culture over there. And you're right, it's probably in the top 2 or 3, if it were a country, it would be in the top 2 or 3 in terms of per capita consumption of tea, because, tea is almost second nature there.
It's almost the highest in the world in that part.
Yes. If you've experienced a strong North Sea storm on the Ostfriesen Islands as well, it can be a pretty rough place, and actually a lovely warming cup of Assam with the clunchit sugar and the cream is just right. It's just right. It just feels right in that environment. And that's another thing about tea, isn't it? You can you've got this versatility that means Absolutely. That it can work in so many different drinking habits.
It's all one, Camellia sinensis, which is the botanical name for tea. Everything flows from that. The hundreds and thousands of teas around the world, when you think about them, and then when you actually dial back to realize that it's all coming from, the 2 leaves and a bud, and then it's the terroir and how you process it, and suddenly that one bush proliferates into hundreds and hundreds of varieties. I think for me, that is just, astounding. We take it for granted, but when you step back and think about that sort of flair and diversity all coming from one plant, it is almost magical.
So I mentioned earlier that I like to drink Assam tea with my English breakfast, with my bacon and eggs. Kurush, perhaps you could tell us your view of what you think Assam tea goes well with.
So I think the English breakfast says it all. The English breakfast is really, there's a lot of fried foods there. There's eggs, there's bacon, there's ham. And, if you were to have a very sort of a mild, delicate green tea with that, it would not even be noticed. You need something equally powerful to punch through that kind of a hearty breakfast. And the full-bodied Assams with its tannins and its accompanying sort of strong finish is what punches through such foods and still gives you a delightful taste. And in terms of food, I mean, in my experience around the world, what I've seen is this principle of, what grows together goes together. And I'll give you a couple of examples with reference to Assam also. So I've seen it in Japan, where the sort of best matchas and senchas, go wonderfully with sushi. Or an example from China, where, the lapsangs and the smoky oolongs go wonderfully with smoked duck or smoked salmon. And if you come back to India, and I'm having this now, I'm not sure if you can see this. This is what we call a little samosa. So it's a little rectangle, sort of a triangular morsel, which we have with our tea typically as street food. And again, it's something which is spicy. It's something that's quite strong. And it just goes wonderfully well with Assam tea, because the principle of accompanying tea and food is, light teas with light foods and heavier teas with heavier foods. And Assam being a heavy tea can take, it goes wonderfully well with staked foods, with grilled, with fast food cuisine. And that's what is best complementing second flush Assam in terms of a food accompaniment.
Yeah, I think really great suggestions, because actually a lot of people don't want to drink alcohol with their evening meals anymore. And I think there's a fantastic role for different types of tea to play in that area. So great suggestions there, Kurush. Thank you. Ravi, did you want to add?
No, I wonder, since the podcast is up in the UK, that the pairing of tea and food started actually in the UK in 1702 by none other than Queen Anne, who started the concept of high tea. So, food pairing is as old as 200 years ago. But like Kurush said, Assam is a strong tea, and it requires to be accompanied by strong food. So typically, cucumber sandwiches are a great add-on with the English breakfast. So are cakes. If Frankies, if you guys have those, your part of the world, we call it rolls here. Frankies are great. Kurush showed you a samosa, which is either filled with potato or it could have minced meat in it. So basically, any savory item would go extremely well with a cup of strong Assam tea.
And Will, we've already learned that you like to have your Assam tea with full-fat Jersey milk. What do you like to eat with your Assam tea?
For me, it's my breakfast tea of choice, Sharon. Every morning, a fearsomely strong cup of Assam tea with some full-fat milk and an English breakfast, and it'll stand up to a strong English mustard or a brown sauce without any trouble, and that's what makes it such a perfect breakfast tea.
I'm glad you said brown sauce, which is definitely what you should have with your English breakfast. I think we've courted a bit of controversy there.
And the only Assam's great virtue is this great power and strength and maltiness and richness. And really, one of the few things you can't use it for is iced tea, and that's about it really, because it's all of those things which give it that wonderful strength and body. The moment it cools, they precipitate, and it turns the tea cloudy. It looks like it had cream added to it. So really, apart from iced tea, I'd give it a try for almost anything.
And that's a really interesting point you raise, Will, which is about the cream that we tea tasters, we describe the creaming quality of Assam tea, and what we mean by that is if you brew an Assam tea and without milk, and if you just allow it to stand for half an hour or an hour, you will find that it develops a sort of a haze-like precipitate on the surface of the cup, and that is effectively the separation of the caffeine which is happening in the solution. And in fact, it's a great hallmark for a high pedigreed tea. So we do actually ascribe great importance to a cup that creams really well. But as you say, because it creates that haze, if you were to make an iced tea out of it, an iced tea would be cloudy. And if you go to the southern United States, their idea of iced tea in a pitcher is for it to be completely transparent and clear. And therefore, an Assam tea just can't cut it in that context. So really it boils back to, horses for courses.
I can definitely confirm that this lovely Assam tea is starting to cream up, and I've got that haze on the surface that you described, Kurush. So
It's got that oily sheen on it.
Yeah.
It's got that oily sheen.
Okay, we're coming to the end of the podcast recording now. If I could just ask all three of you to sum up your views on Assam very briefly. Kurush, I'll come to you first.
So thanks for that, Sharon. I think for me, coming from India and originating from India, Assam is always going to have a nostalgic association wherever I go in the world. And I hope this module has played its role in almost waking up your inner tearista, almost like your inner barista, I would expect. And I hope it turns you into an enduring Assam enthusiast. So happy drinking.
Thank you, Kurush. Ravi?
Yeah. Okay. Assam, in my opinion, is a good for you beverage. With tea and health being a big thing in recent times, particularly post the pandemic, Assam is your cup of tea, as far as I'm concerned. And no wonder the early Chinese writers called it the elixir of life. They called it the jade brew, and it had a lots more that going for it. In fact, if you go back to mythological times in India, I'm sure most of you have read the Ramayana, which is a very popular text in our part of the world. And Sanjeevani plant, which was supposed to have saved Lord Ram, was supposedly the tea plant at that point of time. So it was a good medicinal plant then. It's a good for you beverage today. And well, all I know is it's a very tasty beverage and nothing like Assam tea for you.
What really lovely. And the last word to my co-host, Will.
I just hope that this prompts a few people to go and look for blends that have Assam in, because it's got character and interest and richness and strength and power, and all of those things create interesting teas. Even whether it's as a blend or on its own, it's definitely worth finding a little bit more about and trying some teas out.
Well, Kurush, Ravi and Will, thank you so much for taking us on this tour of Second Flush Assam Teas as part of our Around the World in 80 Teas podcast series. Thank you so much.